Before we begin our journey into the shadowy heart of Rome, I must offer a crucial disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a tapestry woven from countless threads: court documents, investigative reports, pentito testimonies, and historical accounts. It is presented not to glorify the acts of violence, but with the sole purpose of bringing to you, the listener, the most accurate and comprehensive narrative of one of Italy's most formidable and secretive criminal empires. Our aim is solely to deliver correct information, to understand the complex mechanisms of power, crime, and their ultimate consequences. So, find a comfortable space, settle in, and prepare to delve into the true saga of the phantoms of Rome, the Banda della Magliana. The story begins not with a bang, but with a void in the sprawling, neglected suburbs of Rome during the tumultuous 1970s. This was an era of profound social and political upheaval in Italy, the so-called years of lead, marked by terrorist attacks and street violence between far left and far right extremists. Yet, amidst this chaos, the eternal city's criminal landscape was fragmented, a collection of small, disorganized gangs fighting over petty turf. The neighborhood of Magliana, a dusty, semi-rural periphery caught between the Tiber River and the city's ancient core, became the unlikely cradle for a new kind of order. Here, in the fog that rolled off the river and the shadows of unfinished housing projects, a group of ambitious young men, hardened by poverty and the relentless struggle for survival, began to envision a different future. They were not the romanticized mafiosi of Sicily. They were pragmatic, ruthless, and products of their harsh environment. They saw the inefficiency of the constant squabbling and recognized a fundamental truth: unity meant strength. Their initial forays were into classic street crime, robberies, kidnappings for ransom, and extorting local businesses. But their ambitions stretched far beyond the dimly lit streets of Magliana. They looked at the bustling banks, the lucrative drug trade beginning to flood Europe, and the corrupt political machinery of Rome itself. And they saw a universe of opportunity waiting to be seized by those with the courage and the cold-blooded determination to take it. This was the fertile ground from which the Banda della Magliana would grow, a sinister vine preparing to strangle the very heart of the capital. The true catalyst for the transformation of this loose collection of thugs into a structured, formidable organization was the vision of a few key individuals who understood that brute force alone was not enough. Figures like Nicolas, a charismatic and feared leader known for his strategic mind, and Franco Giuseppocci, a ruthless and ambitious man driven by an insatiable greed, began to forge alliances. They were joined by the likes of Edoardo Toscano, Enrico Di Pedis, and the notorious criminal duo known as the R. Camaccio d'Abruzzo and or Passion. These were not just names. They were forces of nature, each bringing their own particular brand of ruthlessness and expertise to the table. The initial meetings were likely held in clandestine locations. A secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of the city, a back room of a smoky bar, always away from prying eyes. The pact was simple, yet revolutionary for its time: an end to gang warfare and the creation of a single, unified syndicate that would monopolize all criminal activity in Rome. Territories were clearly demarcated, and a strict code of conduct was established. Betrayal would be met with death. This was their constitution, written not on paper, but in blood and mutual self-interest. The Banda della Magliana was no longer a concept. It was a living, breathing entity. And its first order of business was to consolidate its power through a campaign of terror that would send a clear, unmistakable message to anyone who dared to oppose them. The old guard of Roman criminality, those who refused to bow to this new order, were systematically hunted down and eliminated. The streets, once noisy with the arguments of competing gangs, fell into a fearful, silent hush, broken only by the sound of gunfire that signaled the birth of a new, and far more dangerous, criminal monopoly. The consolidation of power was a brutal and bloody affair, a necessary baptism by fire to establish the Banda della Magliana's absolute dominance over the Roman underworld. This period was characterized by a series of calculated and public executions, each one designed not just to eliminate a rival, but to serve as a grisly advertisement for the new regime's ruthlessness and efficiency. The old kings of the Roman criminal scene, men who had operated with a degree of impunity for years, suddenly found themselves living on borrowed time. The methods were chillingly consistent. Ambushes in broad daylight, shots to the back of the head in crowded cafes, and bodies left in car trunks as macabre calling cards. One of the first and most significant targets was a powerful gang leader from the Porta area, a man who controlled lucrative rackets and saw the upstarts from Magliana as nothing more than insolent children. His assassination was a masterclass in terror. He was lured to a meeting under the pretense of a truce, only to be met with a hail of bullets from multiple assailants armed with submachine guns. The hit was so violent, so audacious, that it sent shockwaves through every neighborhood in Rome. It was a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. The Banda della Magliana was not interested in sharing. It was interested in owning everything. This campaign of terror was not confined to rival gangsters. Business owners who refused to pay the pizzo, the protection money, found their establishments burned to the ground. Those who went to the police would often be found floating in the Tiber, a silent warning to others. The organization's intelligence network was already formidable. They seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere. This reign of violence had its intended effect. Resistance crumbled. Many smaller gangs, seeing the writing on the wall, chose to align themselves with the new power, absorbing their operations into the growing Magliana empire in exchange for their lives and a slice of the profits. This expansion was meticulously managed. The Banda was not a chaotic mob, it was a corporation of crime, and its product was fear. Each neighborhood was assigned a capizona, a local boss who reported directly to the central directorate, the cupola. This boss was responsible for all criminal activity in his territory: extortion, drug dealing, illegal gambling, and was expected to meet strict financial quotas. The money flowed upwards, a steady river of illicit cash that filled the organization's coffers and funded its further ambitions. This structured approach, mirroring that of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, but with a distinctly Roman pragmatism, allowed the Banda to operate with an efficiency the city had never seen before. They were no longer just criminals. They were a shadow government, imposing their own taxes, their own laws, and their own brutal form of justice on a vast swath of the capital. By the mid-1970s, the Banda della Magliana had achieved its first monumental objective. Rome was theirs. The chaotic, fragmented criminal landscape had been forged into a single, terrifying weapon, and now, with their home base secure, the real masters of the Banda began to look beyond simple street-level extortion. The river of cash from their local rackets was substantial, but it was a mere stream compared to the ocean of wealth that the international heroin trade promised. And so, with their internal structure solidified and their authority unchallenged in the streets of Rome, the phantoms turned their gaze eastward, towards the poppy fields of Turkey and the refining labs of Sicily, ready to carve out their piece of the most lucrative criminal enterprise of the 20th century. The foray into the international heroin trade was the strategic masterstroke that transformed the Banda della Magliana from a powerful local syndicate into a criminal entity of truly global significance. This was not a simple expansion, it was a complex geopolitical maneuver that required forging alliances with the most dangerous and established criminal organizations on the planet. The path to the poppy fields of the Golden Crescent led directly to the doorstep of the Sicilian Mafia, specifically the powerful Corleonesi clan led by the notoriously brutal Rina. For the Sicilians, the Banda della Magliana represented the key to the mainland, controlling the port of Civitavecchia north of Rome, a crucial gateway for shipping narcotics throughout Europe. For the Romans, the Sicilians offered access to the refined heroin and the established trafficking routes. It was a marriage of convenience, brokered in secret summits held in remote villas, where men of violence discussed logistics and profit margins with the cold precision of corporate executives. The agreement was simple. The Sicilians would supply the product, and the Banda della Magliana would handle its distribution across central and northern Italy and into the rest of Europe. This partnership was the Banda's true baptism into the big leagues, and it came with a new level of sophistication and violence. The logistics were immense and required a complete diversification of the organization's skill set. They invested in a fleet of ships and trucks, established complex money laundering operations through front companies and compliant banks, and developed a distribution network that was as efficient as any legitimate multinational corporation. The sheer volume of cash generated was staggering, dwarfing their income from extortion and robbery. Palatial villas sprung up in the Roman countryside. Fleets of luxury cars became commonplace, and the bosses of the Magliana began to live like the Roman emperors of old, their power and wealth on ostentatious display. But this new empire was built on a product that was destroying communities, creating addiction and misery on an unprecedented scale. The Banda was now directly responsible for fueling a public health crisis, a moral decay that they either ignored or saw as merely the cost of doing business. The violence, too, escalated to match the stakes. Disputes over shipments or money were no longer settled with a beating. They were resolved with massacres. The bodies of those who betrayed the organization or skimmed from the profits were often found mutilated, a grim testament to the absolute zero tolerance policy for errors in this new, high-stakes enterprise. The influx of such colossal wealth also had a profound internal effect, solidifying the power of the central cupola and creating a new class of criminal elite within the Banda. Men like Franco Giuseppucci and Enrico Di Patis saw their influence grow exponentially, their control over the drug trade making them fabulously wealthy and, consequently, even more powerful and paranoid. This period, the late 1970s and early 1980s, represented the absolute zenith of the Banda della Magliana's power. They controlled the streets of Rome with an iron fist. They were the principal distributors for the most powerful mafia in Italy, and their financial resources seemed limitless. They were no longer just a criminal gang. They were a state within a state, a phantom government whose influence was about to extend into the highest echelons of Italian political and financial life. An entanglement that would prove to be both their greatest shield and their ultimate curse. The immense wealth and territorial control amassed by the Banda della Magliana could not exist in a vacuum. It required a shield, a network of protection that extended into the very institutions meant to combat them. This led to the most dangerous and defining phase of their existence, the infiltration of the Italian state. Their strategy was twofold, targeting both the political class and the secretive world of intelligence agencies, operating on the principle that the best way to avoid the law was to own the lawmakers and the lawmen. Their entry into this shadowy realm was facilitated by their logistical prowess and their utter lack of political scruples, making them the perfect instrument for powerful forces operating in the background of Italy's fragile democracy. The most infamous and consequential of these alliances was with Propaganda Due, or P2, a clandestine Masonic lodge that operated as a state within a state, comprising a who's who of high-ranking military officers, intelligence agents, politicians, industrialists, and media magnates, for the shadowy figures of P2, led by the enigmatic Licio Gelli. The Banda della Magliana was a potent, deniable weapon. They were a private army, a source of illicit funding, and a means to execute tasks too dirty for any official agency to touch. In return, the Banda received what they needed most: impunity. Investigations into their activities would be mysteriously stalled. Key evidence would vanish from police evidence rooms, and witnesses would often recant their testimonies after receiving a quiet, terrifying visit. This symbiotic relationship transformed the Banda from a mere criminal organization into a key player in a much larger, more sinister game. A strategy of tension where acts of terrorism were sometimes manipulated to shape public opinion and political outcomes. The Banda's logistical network was allegedly used to move weapons. Their hitmen lent out for operations that served this hidden agenda. The most chilling example of this entanglement is the infamous case of the kidnapping of Emanuela Orlandi, the young daughter of a Vatican cleric, in 1983. While the truth remains shrouded in mystery, persistent investigations and pentito testimonies have woven a complex web linking her disappearance to the banda's enforcer, Enrico Di Pedis, and from him to corrupt elements within the Vatican Bank and Italian intelligence, all in a tangled knot of blackmail, financial fraud, and geopolitical maneuvering. This case exemplifies the banda's new role. They were no longer just traffickers and extortionists. They were facilitators for the powerful, the cleaners who handled the messiest jobs. This political protection also extended to the electoral sphere. The Banda used its muscle to influence local elections in Rome, delivering blocks of votes through intimidation and patronage, ensuring that friendly politicians held key positions in city government and the police force. This created a perfect ecosystem for their criminal enterprise to flourish. They had the street-level power to enforce their will, the financial power to corrupt, and the political power to ensure they were untouchable. For a time, it seemed like the perfect, unbreakable system. They had achieved the ultimate criminal dream. They had become phantoms, invisible and omnipotent. Their actions felt everywhere, but their presence seen nowhere. They moved through the corridors of power and the back alleys of Rome with equal ease. Their influence a dark stain spreading through the fabric of Italian society. But this ascent into the rarefied air of state collusion carried within it the seeds of their own destruction. The secrets they now held for powerful men made them a liability, and the internal rivalries, fueled by astronomical profits and the intoxication of such immense power, were about to boil over into a war that would tear the organization apart from the inside. The intoxicating and seemingly absolute power the Banda della Magliana had achieved, intertwined as it was with the highest and most secretive levels of the state, created an environment ripe for internal decay. The very structure that had made them strong, a disciplined, corporate-like hierarchy, began to crack under the weight of its own success. The river of gold flowing from the heroin trade and the sense of invincibility granted by their political shields fostered an atmosphere of unchecked ambition and paranoia among the top bosses. The first major tremor that signaled the beginning of the end was the fracturing of the relationship with their Sicilian allies, the Corleonesi, under the ruthlessly ambitious Totterina, were not partners who believed in equality. They were predators who believed in total domination. What began as a symbiotic partnership began to feel, from the Roman perspective, more like a subjugation. The Sicilians started making heavier demands, exerting more control over the distribution networks, and treating the Banda less as partners and more as subordinates. This was a direct challenge to the authority and pride of the Roman bosses, particularly to men like Franco Giuseppucci, who had built their empires on a foundation of absolute autonomy and local supremacy. Simultaneously, within the Roman cupola itself, fissures were appearing. The immense wealth was not distributed equally, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate. who was skimming from the top, who was conspiring with the Sicilians behind the backs of the others. The original pact of blood and mutual interest was being eroded by greed and suspicion. The first major casualty of this internal Cold War was Edoardo Toscano, one of the organization's founding members. Toscano, a man known for his volatile and ambitious nature, was perceived as a loose cannon, a potential threat to the stability of the entire organization. His relationship with the core leadership, particularly with Giuseppucci, had soared, likely over control of drug routes or financial disputes. In a stark demonstration of the Banda's new ruthlessness towards its own, Toscano was lured into a trap and executed on the orders of his former brothers. His body was disposed of, a ghost vanishing without a trace. This was not the elimination of a rival gangster. This was a fratricide, a stark message that no one, not even a founder, was safe. The murder of Toscano did not quell the unrest. It amplified it. It set a dangerous precedent and confirmed the deepest fears of every other boss, that the power they had built could just as easily be turned inward. The atmosphere within the cupola became toxic. Alliances shifted like sand, and every meeting was fraught with tension, each man wondering if the hand he shook would be the one to later pull the trigger. The external pressure from the increasingly demanding and aggressive Corleonesi, combined with this internal rod of mistrust, created a pressure cooker that was inevitably going to explode. The Banda della Magliana was at a crossroads, perched at the peak of its power, but staring into the abyss of its own self-destruction. The phantoms of Rome, who had operated for so long in a unified silence, were now preparing to war against their own shadows, a conflict that would be fought in the very streets they had conquered, a civil war that would be more brutal and more final than any battle they had ever fought against their external enemies. The simmering tensions within the Banda della Magliana finally erupted into open warfare in the early 1980s, a brutal internal conflict that would become known as the Great War of Magliana. This was not a single battle, but a protracted series of ambushes, betrayals, and executions that turned the streets of Rome into a hunting ground, where the hunters and the hunted were all members of the same fractured family. The catalyst for this bloody schism was the escalating conflict with the Corleonesi, which forced every boss within the Banda to choose a side, exposing the fatal fault lines that greed and power had created. On one side stood the faction led by Franco Giuseppucci, known as Frankie the Skinny, who advocated for a firm stance against the Sicilians, believing that the Banda's independence was non-negotiable. Opposing him was a coalition that included Enrico de Pedis and others who, whether out of pragmatism, fear, or personal ambition, were willing to submit to the Corleonesi's demands, seeing it as the only way to survive the overwhelming force of Tot, Rina's organization. This ideological split quickly became personal, morphing into a deadly struggle for the very soul and future of the Magliana syndicate. The war began in earnest with a failed assassination attempt that shattered any last illusion of unity. A hit squad loyal to the pro Sicily faction ambushed Giuseppucci's car in the city center, unleashing a volley of gunfire that miraculously failed to kill him. The message, however, was received loud and clear. There was no going back. Giuseppucci, now a marked man, went into hiding, but he was far from defeated. From his secret lairs, he directed a ruthless counter-offensive, targeting his former comrades with cold precision. The city became a chessboard of death. Hitmen stalked their targets outside favorite restaurants, in public piazzas, and in the narrow lanes of the very neighborhoods they once controlled together. The code of silence, the omerta that had protected them for so long, was broken. The violence was shockingly public, designed to send messages of terror not just to the enemy faction, but to the entire city, a demonstration that the masters of Rome were at war with themselves. The body count began to rise, each killing more audacious than the last. The war was not just fought with bullets, it was a war of information. Each side desperately tried to turn members of the other, using a mixture of promises, threats, and brutal intimidation. The internal trust that had been the bedrock of the organization evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing paranoia where every glance could be a threat and every conversation a potential setup. This internal chaos provided the first real opening for the authorities, who had been largely neutralized by the banda's political connections. The sheer volume of bloodshed made it impossible to look away, and a new generation of magistrates and police investigators, less compromised and more determined, began to slowly and carefully piece together the fragments of this hidden war. The Banda della Magliana, which had operated for a decade like a phantom, was now bleeding profusely in the public square, its once formidable structure crippled by its own hand. The Great War was a self-inflicted wound from which the organization would never truly recover. A tragic and violent spectacle that marked the beginning of the end for the criminal empire that had once held Rome in an iron grip. The internal civil war reached its brutal, inevitable climax with the death of Franco Giuseppucci, a killing that was not merely an assassination, but a meticulously staged execution, a symbolic act designed to shatter the spirit of the faction that dared to defy the Corleonesi and their allies within the Banda. Giuseppucci, having narrowly escaped previous attempts on his life, had become a ghost, moving between safe houses, his paranoia a constant companion. Yet, even the most cautious prey cannot evade a determined hunter forever. On a seemingly ordinary day in 1983, Giuseppucci was tracked to a private clinic in the Roman suburbs, a place where he felt secure enough to receive medical treatment. This intelligence, like so much in this shadow war, was likely provided by his former allies who knew his movements and his vulnerabilities. The hit squad that descended upon the clinic operated with a chilling, military-like precision. They neutralized any potential witnesses, moved directly to their target's room, and delivered the final, fatal shots. The killing of Frankie the Skinny was a message written in blood, a declaration that the rebellion was over and that the price for defiance was death. His body, left in the sterile, clinical environment of the medical facility, was a stark contrast to the violent, messy end he had met. The aftermath of his death sent seismic shocks through the remnants of the Banda della Magliana. For his loyalists, it was a catastrophic blow, decapitating their resistance and leaving them leaderless, hunted, and demoralized. Many were forced to flee Rome, go into deep hiding, or were systematically hunted down and eliminated in the weeks and months that followed. For the victorious faction, led by figures like Enrico di Pedis, it was a moment of triumph, but a hollow and precarious one. They had won the civil war, but they had done so by aligning themselves with the very Sicilian Mafia that Giuseppe had fought to resist, effectively reducing their own powerful, independent organization to a provincial branch of the Corleonese Empire. The victory had come at an enormous cost. The streets were littered with the bodies of their former comrades. The organization's manpower was severely depleted, and the once impenetrable veil of secrecy had been torn asunder by the very public and bloody nature of their conflict. The financial toll was also immense, with lucrative rackets disrupted and millions of lire spent on financing the war, on weapons, on safe houses, and on supporting the families of imprisoned or fallen soldiers. The Banda emerged from the Great War of Magliana as a deeply scarred and weakened entity, its myth of invincibility shattered. It was still a dangerous and powerful criminal force, but it was no longer the unified, disciplined phantom that had once held absolute sway. It was now a kingdom divided, ruled by a faction whose authority was predicated on the approval of an external and notoriously treacherous power. The death of Giuseppe did not bring peace. It merely established a new, more fragile and oppressive order, one that was built on a foundation of betrayal and drenched in the blood of its founders, an order that would now have to navigate the increasing scrutiny of a state that was no longer willing or able to look the other way. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the victorious faction of the Banda della Magliana, now firmly under the influence of the Corleonesi and led by the increasingly powerful Enrico di Pedis, faced a new and daunting challenge: consolidation and survival. The first order of business was a brutal mopping up operation, a final solution to ensure no lingering loyalty to the old Giuseppe faction could ever resurface and threaten the new regime. This meant that anyone even remotely suspected of sympathizing with the defeated side was marked for death. The killings continued, though they were now less about open warfare and more about surgical eradication. Former allies were lured to meetings under false pretenses and executed in cold blood. Their bodies were often disposed of in what became the organization's grim signature: cars set ablaze in remote fields or weighted down corpses sunk into the murky depths of the Tiber River. This period was one of pure terror within the ranks, a deliberate campaign to instill absolute obedience through fear. The message was unequivocal: dissent was extinct, and the new leadership would tolerate no challenge to its authority, an authority that was now indirectly derived from the terrifying power of Taormina in Sicily. With the internal opposition physically annihilated or driven into silent, fearful compliance, the Banda set about restructuring its criminal empire. The lucrative heroin trade, the cause of so much bloodshed, was now fully integrated into the Corleonese's global network, with the Romans acting as the principal distributors for central and northern Italy. This required a new level of sophistication in money laundering, as the sheer volume of cash was staggering. They invested heavily in the legitimate economy, purchasing restaurants, construction companies, and real estate, using these fronts to legitimize their illicit gains and embed themselves deeper into the fabric of Roman society. Enrico di Pedis, in particular, became a master of this double life. He was the feared gangster, the ruthless enforcer, but he was also a public figure, a benefactor to his local church, the Sant'Apollinare in Rome's city center, where he would often be seen attending Mass and making generous donations. This was not an act of piety, but a calculated move to cultivate an aura of respectability and to forge a powerful alliance with another sovereign state within Rome, the Vatican. This relationship with the Holy See, particularly through the Istituto per l'Opera di Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank, became a cornerstone of the Banda's survival strategy in the post-war era. It was widely suspected that the organization used the bank's opaque financial systems to launder hundreds of billions of lire, moving money across international borders with the protection of the Church's sovereign immunity. This alliance provided a shield that even their political connections in the Italian state could not offer, creating a sanctuary for their wealth and a powerful patron in the shadowy world of international finance. For a few years, it seemed as if the Banda had successfully navigated its darkest hour. The violence subsided from the open warfare of the early 80s to a more controlled, disciplinary violence. The money flowed more steadily than ever before. They had tamed their internal divisions through sheer brutality and had secured powerful new external allies. But this fragile stability was an illusion, a calm before the final storm. The very actions they had taken to survive, the deeper entanglement with the treacherous Corleonese, the brazen infiltration of the Vatican, and the mountain of bodies they had left in their wake, had created a web of vulnerabilities. Each powerful ally was also a potential master, and each secret they held for these masters made them a liability. The state, which had been momentarily blinded by the internal complexity of the gang war, was now slowly, methodically, and with renewed determination, beginning to focus its gaze upon them, piecing together the fragments of their empire from the testimony of the dead and the fear of the living. The fragile peace that the Banda della Magliana had purchased with so much blood began to crumble under the weight of its own inherent contradictions and the relentless, patient work of the Italian state. The first and most significant crack in their armor appeared from within, in the form of a legal instrument that would prove to be the undoing of organized crime in Italy. The pentito, or collaborator with justice, the Code of Omert, the sacred vow of silence that had once been the bedrock of their organization, was shattered by the very men who had helped build the empire. The internal war had created deep wells of resentment and fear, and when the state offered protection and reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation, it found willing participants among the ranks of the defeated, the imprisoned, and the disillusioned. The first major breakthrough for the investigators came from a relatively low-level associate. But his testimony provided a roadmap, a glimpse into the inner workings of the banda that they had never had before. He named names, described murders, and detailed the structure of the cupola. This initial crack in the dam of silence was followed by a flood. More important figures, facing life sentences for the mountains of evidence slowly accumulating against them, began to see collaboration as their only way out. They were placed in a witness protection program. Their families relocated, their identities changed, and they began to talk for days, weeks, and months, filling thousands of pages of transcripts with the dark history of the Magliana. They confessed to their own crimes, and more importantly, to the crimes of their bosses. They detailed the kidnapping of Emanuela Orlandi, the intricate money laundering schemes through the Vatican Bank, the political connections, and the secret pact with the Corleonesi. The testimony of the pentiti was the key that unlocked a decade of mysteries. It allowed magistrates like Domenico Spinelli and Carlo Palermo to begin constructing airtight cases against the surviving leadership. Arrest warrants were issued for the most famous names of the banda. Enrico de Pettis, the flamboyant and powerful kingpin, was arrested in 1987, a monumental victory for the state. The myth of his invincibility, bolstered by his Vatican connections, was publicly broken as he was led away in handcuffs. The state was no longer just reacting to individual murders. It was now systematically dismantling the entire organization, branch by branch, following the detailed blueprints provided by the men who had built it. The banda, which had operated for so long in the shadows, was now being dragged into the harsh light of the courtroom. Its secrets, its rituals, its financial records, and its murderous commands were all laid bare for judges, juries, and the public to see. The phantom was being given a body, a name, and a face, and it was a face scarred by greed, betrayal, and violence. The era of impunity was over. The shields of political and ecclesiastical protection began to falter under the weight of judicial scrutiny and public outrage. The Banda della Magliana was now fighting for its very existence, not against a rival gang, but against the relentless, methodical force of the law, a force that was finally armed with the one thing it had always lacked: the truth, spoken from the mouths of its own creators. The arrest of its key leaders, however, did not immediately spell the end of the Banda della Magliana. Instead, it initiated a protracted and complex legal battle that would play out in courtrooms across Italy for years, a battle where the organization fought back with every weapon at its disposal, from intimidation and the murder of witnesses to leveraging its remaining political connections. The trials became spectacles, dramatic reenactments of a decade of terror, with the pentiti appearing behind screens or with their voices distorted, recounting tales of murder and corruption that seemed to belong to a thriller novel. rather than the reality of Rome's recent history. The defense strategies were multifaceted and ruthless. Outside the courtrooms, a campaign of terror was unleashed against those who dared to testify. Witnesses who were not in the protected pentito program received anonymous threats. Their cars were vandalized, and their families were harassed. A clear message that the banda's long arm could still reach out from behind bars. This atmosphere of fear was a deliberate tool to create mistrust in the witness testimonies and to discourage others from coming forward. Inside the courtrooms, defense attorneys, some of the best that the organization's vast wealth could buy, worked tirelessly to dismantle the credibility of the collaborators, painting them as self-serving liars who were inventing stories to save their own skins. They highlighted the inconsistencies in their testimonies, their own direct involvement in heinous crimes, and the generous benefits they received from the state in exchange for their cooperation. It was a war of attrition, a battle for the narrative of the banda itself. Was it a structured, mafia-like organization, as the prosecution alleged, or was it merely a loose association of common criminals, as the defense contended? The outcome of this debate would determine the severity of the sentences and the legal precedent for future cases. Meanwhile, the remaining bosses still at large, a younger, more volatile generation, attempted to keep the criminal enterprise afloat. They continued the drug trade, the extortion rackets, and the money laundering, but the golden age was over. The constant police surveillance, the internal distrust sowed by the pentiti, and the relentless seizure of assets by the authorities made every operation a high-risk endeavor. The organization was bleeding not from a single wound, but from 1,000 cuts inflicted by the judicial system. The once seamless network was now fragmented and paranoid, with each crew operating more independently, often coming into conflict with each other over the dwindling resources. The central cupola, which had once commanded absolute obedience, was now either in prison or dead, its authority replaced by the chaotic and violent ambitions of lesser men. The banda was devolving back into the very state of disorganized chaos from which it had risen, completing a tragic and violent full circle. The trials, therefore, were not just legal proceedings. They were the final act in the dismantling of a myth. Every conviction was a brick removed from the wall of their empire. Every life sentence handed down to a boss like Enrico Di Pettis was a symbolic decapitation. The courtrooms became the final battlefield where the state, armed with the law and the words of repentant killers, was systematically and irrevocably defeating the criminal state that the Banda della Magliana had built in the heart of Rome. As the 1980s drew to a close, the noose tightened inexorably around the neck of the Banda della Magliana, and the final acts of its tragedy were written not in the boardrooms of power, but in the grim, personal downfalls of its most iconic leaders. The figure who perhaps best embodied the organization's dramatic arc, its rise, its arrogance, and its brutal end, was Enrico Di Pettis, the man known as Renatino. Having been arrested and convicted for his numerous crimes, including multiple murders, Dipetus found himself facing the rest of his life in prison, a fate he could not accept. Yet, even from his cell, he was believed to be pulling strings, managing affairs, and most dangerously, holding onto the secrets that connected the Banda to the Vatican and the secret services. He was a living repository of information that could bring down institutions, and in the shadowy world he inhabited, such individuals often have a short lifespan. On a February morning in 1990, Dipetus was granted a rare day leave from prison, a controversial and suspicious privilege that allowed him to visit a bank in central Rome. As he walked out of the financial institution, he was ambushed by two gunmen on a motorcycle who fired a precise and fatal volley of shots, killing him instantly on the pavement. The assassination of Enrico Dipetus was a classic mafia-style execution, but its purpose was the subject of intense speculation. Was it an act of revenge from the remnants of the Giuseppucci faction? Was it a message from the Corleonesi, who no longer had use for a compromised and imprisoned associate? Or, most chillingly, was it a silencing, orchestrated by those powerful forces in the state or the Vatican whose secrets he carried to his grave? His murder, like that of so many others, remains officially unsolved, a final, fitting mystery for a man who lived his life in the shadows. His death sent a clear message to every other surviving member of the Banda. There was no retirement plan, no peaceful exile. The only ways out were prison, a pentito's protected life, or a coffin. The organization was now a ship taking on water from all sides, its crew mutinous and its captains dead or imprisoned. The state's financial investigations began to bear fruit, with authorities seizing millions of dollars in assets, villas, businesses, bank accounts, and luxury cars, systematically dismantling the economic foundation that had funded their empire for over a decade. The once mighty Banda della Magliana was being erased, both physically and financially. Its members were scattered, its hierarchy broken, and its myth shattered. The fear it had instilled began to slowly dissipate, replaced by a public sense of grim vindication as the headlines chronicled each new conviction and asset seizure. The phantoms of Rome were being exorcised by the relentless, patient force of the law. The city itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if emerging from a long, dark night. The reign of the Banda was effectively over. The war was won, but the final, meticulous work of mopping up the remnants, of tracking down the last fugitives, and securing the final convictions would continue for years. A long and tedious process that would ensure the organization could never again rise from the ashes of its own self-destruction. The official dissolution of the Banda della Magliana in the early 1990s did not mean that every single member was behind bars or that every criminal operation ceased instantly. Rather, it signified the irreversible fragmentation of its core structure and the annihilation of its governing cupola, leaving behind a landscape littered with disparate, disconnected cells that lacked the centralized command, the political clout, and the unifying vision that had once made them an empire. The legacy they left behind was a complex and dark stain on the soul of Rome, a multifaceted lesson in the anatomy of power. On one hand, their story is a brutal testament to the potent force of ambition and organization, a case study in how a group of determined individuals from the margins of society can, through ruthlessness and strategic genius, build an entity capable of challenging the state itself. They demonstrated a chilling ability to adapt, evolving from street thugs into sophisticated international traffickers, and finally into shadowy power brokers operating in the highest echelons of finance and politics. This ascent, however, was mirrored by a descent into an almost Shakespearean tragedy of betrayal and self-destruction. Their narrative arc serves as a powerful and eternal warning about the inherent instability of power built solely on fear and money, a foundation that is always vulnerable to the corrosive forces of greed and paranoia from within. The internal war that consumed them is perhaps their most enduring lesson, that no criminal enterprise, no matter how powerful, is immune to the poison of its own success. The Banda's history also forced Italy to confront the uncomfortable and pervasive reality of the piovra, the octopus whose tentacles reached into every facet of public life. Their proven connections to propaganda due, to factions within the secret services, and to the Vatican Bank revealed a deeply compromised state, a system where the lines between legitimate authority and criminal enterprise were not just blurred, but often non-existent. The trials and the pentiti testimonies did not just convict gangsters. They exposed a shadow government, a system of parallel power that operated in the darkness, using organizations like the Banda as its instruments and its shock troops. In this sense, the defeat of the Banda was also a partial cleansing of the Italian state, a painful but necessary process that led to judicial reforms, a greater reliance on collaborator testimony, and a more vigilant public awareness of the corrupt symbiosis between crime and politics. The physical legacy was also tangible. The neighborhoods of Magliana and other Roman suburbs bore the scars of their reign. A generation traumatized by violence, businesses that had been crushed by extortion, and families destroyed by the heroin that the Banda had so efficiently pumped into the city's veins. They left behind a city that was wiser, more cynical, and forever marked by the understanding that beneath the glorious facade of ancient ruins and Renaissance art, a very modern and very brutal war for the soul of the city had been fought and won at an enormous cost. The Banda della Magliana was gone, but its ghost would haunt Rome for decades, a spectral reminder of how close the eternal city had come to being permanently possessed by its own phantoms. The ghost of the Banda della Magliana, however, did not rest quietly, and its long, dark shadow continued to fall across Italy for years after its operational demise, primarily through a series of sensational judicial investigations and trials that sought to untangle the web of its political and institutional collusions. The most profound and unsettling of these mysteries, one that remains an open wound in the Italian consciousness, is the 1983 disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi, the 15-year-old daughter of a Vatican clerk. From the beginning, the case was mired in a fog of misinformation, false leads, and an almost palpable resistance from various powerful entities. For decades, it was treated as a standalone tragedy, but as investigators dug deeper, and as pentiti from the Banda began to talk, a disturbing narrative emerged, inextricably linking the girl's fate to the organization's most notorious enforcer, Enrico D. Pettis. According to various collaborator testimonies, the kidnapping was not a random act, but a carefully orchestrated operation commissioned by powerful figures within the Vatican Bank itself, allegedly to pressure the Italian state over a financial dispute or to secure the release of Mehmet Ali Aka, the Turkish gunman who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II. In this version of events, D. Pettis and the Banda were the hired muscle, the practical executors of a plot conceived in the highest corridors of ecclesiastical power. They were the ones who allegedly abducted Emanuela and held her as a bargaining chip. The theory suggests that when the negotiations failed or the situation became too dangerous, the girl was killed and her body hidden, becoming a secret that the Banda, and particularly De Pettis, carried with them. This connection was taken so seriously that in 2012, at the request of the Orlandi family's lawyers, the tomb of Enrico D. Pettis in the Sant Apollinare Basilica was opened and searched for any clues or her possible remains, though nothing was found. The very fact that a notorious gangster was buried in such a prestigious and secure location only fueled speculation about the depth of his ties to the Vatican. The Orlandi case is the ultimate symbol of the Banda's legacy, a bottomless pit of unanswered questions where crime, politics, and religion converge, creating a black hole of truth that continues to consume the efforts of journalists, magistrates, and a grieving family. It is a stark reminder that the fall of the Banda's military structure did not mean that all its secrets were revealed. Many were buried with its members or remained protected by the powerful institutions that had used their services. This case, more than any other, demonstrates that the true power of the Banda della Magliana was not just in the men they killed or the drugs they sold, but in the secrets they kept, secrets that were valuable enough to warrant their protection and, ultimately, their silence. The unresolved fate of Emanuela Orlandi is a perpetual echo of the Banda's reign, a chilling testament to the fact that while the organization itself was dismantled, the full extent of its influence and the dark bargains it made may never be fully known, leaving a permanent stain of doubt and sorrow on the history of modern Italy. Beyond the haunting mystery of Emanuela Orlandi, the cultural and social legacy of the Banda della Magliana embedded itself deeply into the Italian psyche, transforming from a current event into a dark legend, a subject of endless fascination for filmmakers, novelists, and journalists. The story had all the elements of a classic epic, a rise from humble origins, a quest for ultimate power, a star-crossed internal war, and a dramatic, bloody fall. In the years following their dissolution, the Banda became a recurring character in Italian popular culture, its narrative reframed and reinterpreted through various lenses. The most significant of these was the groundbreaking 2005 television miniseries, Romanzo Criminale, based on the novel of the same name by Giancarlo di Cataldo, which, while fictionalizing names and certain events, laid bare the entire saga for a national audience. The series did not glorify the characters, but presented them as tragic, flawed figures, products of a specific time and place, driven by ambitions that ultimately consumed them. It brought the story of the Magliana to a generation too young to remember the headlines, cementing the names like the Lebanese, the Dandy, and Fredo into the national consciousness as archetypes of a certain kind of Italian criminal. This cultural processing was a crucial part of the nation's coming to terms with its recent, violent past. It was a way to examine the phenomenon from a safe distance, to dissect the mechanics of power and betrayal without the immediate fear that the organization once instilled. The Banda's story also became a cautionary tale studied by criminologists and sociologists, a prime example of how a non-hereditary criminal organization could rise to mafia, like status through sheer force of will and strategic innovation. They were a model that other criminal groups in Italy and beyond would look to, a blueprint for how to modernize traditional racketeering and integrate it with global narcotics trafficking. Socially, the neighborhoods that birthed the Banda, particularly Magliana itself, were left with a complex and ambiguous heritage. On one hand, there was the stigma of being the cradle of this criminal empire, a reputation that was hard to shake. On the other, for some, there was a twisted sense of local pride in the notoriety, a perverse identification with the power that these homegrown boys had once wielded over the entire city, a narrative of having put their forgotten suburb on the map, however infamously. This duality is a common feature in the heartlands of organized crime, where the line between community protector and predatory parasite is often deliberately blurred by the criminals themselves. The Banda's legacy, therefore, is not monolithic. It is a mosaic of fear, fascination, tragedy, and grim historical fact. It exists in the court transcripts that filled archives, in the fictionalized characters on screen, in the whispered stories in the bars of Magliana, and in the silent grief of the Orlandi family. They became more than just a criminal group. They became a symbol of an entire era. The years of Lead and their aftermath, a period when Italy was forced to stare into its own abyss and confront the phantoms that had taken root in its capital. The dismantling of the Banda della Magliana by the Italian state, while a monumental achievement, did not result in a vacuum of criminal power in Rome. Rather, it created a fragmented landscape that was swiftly filled by new, and in some ways more insidious, criminal entities. The most significant of these was the rapid and aggressive expansion of the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia, which had been quietly building its financial and logistical strength, while the Camorra and Cosa Nostra captured the headlines. The fall of the Banda presented the 'Ndrangheta with a golden opportunity. They were a very different kind of organization, more patient, more family-based, and with an unparalleled mastery of infiltrating the legitimate economy. They moved into Rome not with the loud, territorial wars that had characterized the Banda's rise, but with a silent, capillary, like infiltration. They invested the billions earned from their global cocaine monopoly into real estate, restaurants, and public works contracts in the capital, buying silence and influence rather than demanding it with a gun. This shift marked a new, more dangerous phase in Italian organized crime. The Banda della Magliana, for all its power, was a quintessentially Roman phenomenon, its ambitions and operations largely contained within the borders of Italy. The 'Ndrangheta, by contrast, was a global corporation, and their presence in Rome was just one node in a worldwide network. This comparison highlights the unique nature of the Banda. They were a product of a very specific time and place, the social turmoil of 1970s Rome, the initial boom of the heroin trade, and the corruptible political landscape of the First Republic. They were, in a sense, a phenomenon that could not be replicated. Their model of a centralized, corporate-style cupola controlling a single city was both their strength and their ultimate weakness. As the decapitation of that leadership led to its collapse, the 'Ndrangheta, with its horizontal, clan-based structure, is far more resilient. The fate of the Banda also served as a grim lesson for these newer groups about the dangers of internal warfare and the critical importance of maintaining a low profile. The very public and bloody implosion of the Magliana syndicate was a masterclass in what not to do for an organization seeking long-term survival in the 21st century. The new masters of Rome's underworld learned to avoid the spotlight, to eschew the flashy violence that drew police attention, and to focus instead on the silent, corrosive power of economic domination. In this way, the ghost of the Banda della Magliana continues to influence Italian crime, not as a model to be emulated, but as a cautionary tale of hubris and the inherent instability of a criminal empire built on a personality cult and public terror. The war against the Banda was a war that could be won with bullets, trials, and collaborator testimonies. The war against the 'Ndrangheta and its ilk is a much more complex battle, fought in bank transactions, corporate registries, and government procurement offices. A battle where the enemy is often invisible and its true power hidden behind a facade of legitimate business. The story of the Banda della Magliana is ultimately a human story, a sprawling tapestry woven with threads of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and a profound, tragic failure to see the abyss that lay at the end of the path they had chosen. To understand their saga only through the lens of their crimes is to miss its deeper, more universal resonance. These were not mythical monsters born in a vacuum. They were boys from the Roman periphery, products of a society that had, in many ways, failed them, who then chose to build their own kingdom from the rubble of that failure. Their initial dream of unity and power, while criminal in its execution, contained a perverse logic, a desire to bring order to their chaotic world and to claim a piece of the prosperity that seemed reserved for others. For a time, they succeeded beyond their wildest imaginations, becoming the undisputed masters of Rome. Their names whispered with a mixture of terror and a strange, grudging respect. They lived like modern-day Caesars, their wealth and influence a stark contrast to the poverty of their origins. Yet, this very success contained the poison that would destroy them. The immense power they wielded was never tempered by wisdom or morality. It was raw, unchecked, and ultimately corrupting. The initial bonds of brotherhood, forged in the struggle of the Magliana slums, could not withstand the corrosive effects of billions of lire and the intoxicating allure of absolute control. The same ambition that drove them to unite the Roman underworld later drove them to tear each other apart. The internal war was not just a strategic conflict over drug routes. It was a Shakespearean tragedy of brother against brother, a violent unraveling of the very fabric of their shared identity. Men who had once trusted each other with their lives now saw only potential betrayers in each other's eyes. The paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy as each preemptive strike created new vendettas and new reasons for fear. The downfall of the Banda is a stark lesson in the limits of power built on a foundation of fear and money. It demonstrates that without a higher purpose, without loyalty that transcends material gain, even the most formidable empire is hollow and destined to collapse from within. Their story is a timeless reminder that the pursuit of power for its own sake is a path that leads inevitably to isolation, paranoia, and self-destruction. They sought to become phantoms, untouchable and feared, but in the end, they became prisoners of their own legend, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, looking at each other with suspicion and waiting for the knife that they knew would eventually come from the hand of a brother. Their legacy, therefore, is not just a chapter in the history of crime. It is a moral fable about the emptiness of a life dedicated solely to domination. A cautionary tale that echoes through the ages, reminding us that the true cost of such power is always the loss of one's own humanity. The final, lingering question that the saga of the Banda della Magliana poses is not about what they were, but about what they represent in the broader context of Italy's ongoing struggle with its own identity and the deep-seated corruption within its institutions. The Banda was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a diseased body politic, a malignant growth that flourished in an environment where the lines between the state and the underworld were deliberately and systematically blurred. Their ability to operate with such impunity for over a decade is an indictment not just of a few corrupt policemen or politicians, but of an entire system that was, and to some extent still is, vulnerable to infiltration by criminal interests. The Banda's story forces a national introspection about the concept of the deep state. In Italy, a shadowy realm where Masonic lodges like P2, factions of the intelligence apparatus, and elements of the financial world could collude with murderers and drug traffickers to pursue agendas that remained hidden from the democratic process. The very fact that an organization as brutal as the Banda could become a tool, a deniable asset for such powerful forces, reveals a profound sickness at the heart of the First Republic. This is perhaps the most damaging and enduring aspect of their legacy, the proof that the Italian state was, at times, not a monolithic entity fighting crime, but a fractured and contested space where different power centers, Both legal and illegal, fought for control, often using the same brutal methods. The defeat of the Banda, therefore, was only a partial victory. While the specific criminal group was dismantled, the underlying conditions that allowed it to thrive, political corruption, institutional opacity, and economic inequality, persisted. The Ndrangheta's subsequent takeover of Rome's criminal economy is a testament to this failure to address the root causes. The Banda's history is a permanent stain on the national conscience, a reminder that the fight against organized crime is not just a law enforcement issue, but a continuous battle for the soul of the nation's institutions, a battle that requires eternal vigilance, a free and courageous press, and an unwavering commitment to judicial independence. The story of the Magliana is a warning that when the state fails in its basic duties, when it cannot provide justice and opportunity for its citizens in the peripheries, it creates a vacuum that will inevitably be filled by other, darker forms of order. The boys from Magliana built their empire because the legitimate empire had abandoned them. This does not excuse their monstrous actions, but it does help to explain them, framing their rise not as a spontaneous eruption of evil, but as a predictable consequence of systemic failure. To remember the Banda della Magliana is to remember this uncomfortable truth, to acknowledge that the phantom was not just an external enemy, but a creation of the very society it terrorized, a dark reflection of its deepest flaws and unresolved contradictions. As we near the conclusion of this dark saga, it is essential to reflect on the individuals who dared to stand against the tide of terror, the magistrates, police officers, and the courageous pentiti whose collective efforts eventually brought the Banda della Magliana to its knees. These men and women, often working in the face of immense personal risk and institutional inertia, were the antithesis of the organization they fought. Where the Banda sowed fear and silence, they cultivated courage and truth. Magistrates like Carlo Palermo and Domenico Spinelli pursued their investigations with a dogged determination, piecing together a puzzle where the pieces were bodies, lies, and encrypted bank records. They operated in an environment where a wrong turn could lead to an ambush, where a trusted colleague could be on the payroll of the enemy, and where the very institutions they served were sometimes actively working against them. Theirs was a lonely and perilous path fueled by an unwavering belief in the rule of law. Similarly, the police officers on the front lines, conducting surveillance and making arrests, knew that their badges were no protection against the organization's ruthlessness. A family member could be targeted, a car could be rigged with a bomb, a routine traffic stop could turn into a fatal shootout. They faced an enemy that was embedded in the city, invisible and omnipresent. And then there were the pentiti, the collaborators, whose role was the most complex and morally ambiguous of all. These were not innocent men. They were murderers and drug traffickers who had helped build the empire they were now helping to destroy. Their decision to break the code of omerty was born not from sudden remorse, but often from a calculated survival instinct, from the fear of a life in prison or a bullet from a former friend. Yet, despite their impure motives, their testimony was the weapon that broke the banda's back. By speaking, they performed a paradoxical service to the state, trading their silence for a chance at redemption. However partial, they humanized the horror, providing the narrative that connected the dots between a murder in Magliana and a money transfer in the Vatican. The victory over the Banda was not achieved by a single hero, but by a fragile alliance of these disparate forces: the idealistic magistrate, the brave police officer, and the self-serving gangster. It was a messy, imperfect, and often morally compromised battle, but it was a battle that had to be won. The story of their resistance is a crucial counterpoint to the narrative of the Banda's power, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who will not be corrupted, who will not be intimidated, and who will continue to fight for justice, even when the odds seem insurmountable. They were the light that slowly, painstakingly, pushed back the darkness, proving that the state, for all its flaws and vulnerabilities, could ultimately reclaim its authority from the hands of the phantoms. Now, as we draw the final threads of this epic narrative together, we arrive at the ultimate, sobering legacy of the Banda della Magliana, a legacy that transcends the specific history of a single criminal organization and speaks to the eternal cycle of power, corruption, and the fragile nature of memory itself. The physical empire they built is long gone. Their drug routes have been taken over by others. Their seized villas have new owners. And the streets of Magliana now echo with the sounds of a new generation, largely unaware of the blood that once stained the pavement. The bosses are mostly dead, their names fading from public discourse, remembered only in true crime documentaries and the fading memories of an aging population. Yet, their story persists not as a living threat, but as a ghost, a cautionary phantom that haunts the collective subconscious of the city. The true legacy of the Banda is the indelible lesson it imprinted upon Italy. That organized crime is not a foreign invasion, but a homegrown cancer that thrives in the specific conditions of social neglect, political cynicism, and economic disparity. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that crime, when organized on a corporate scale and blessed with political protection, can achieve a terrifying level of sophistication and power, becoming a state within a state, a parallel sovereignty that challenges the very legitimacy of the Republic. The Banda's history is a permanent benchmark against which all other criminal phenomena in Italy are measured, a reminder of how close the abyss truly is. But perhaps the most profound and unsettling aspect of their legacy is the realization that the defeat of one such organization does not mean the eternal victory of good over evil. It is merely the closing of one chapter. The 'Ndrangheta's silent, economic conquest of Rome is proof that the criminal instinct is hydra-headed, cut off one head, and another, often more resilient and adaptable, grows in its place. The battle is never truly over, it simply changes form. The Banda della Magliana, in its violent and dramatic rise and fall, served as a brutal teacher. It taught the state how to fight a modern criminal syndicate, leading to legal reforms and new investigative techniques. It taught society the importance of vigilance and the courage required to break the code of silence. And it taught a grim lesson about human nature itself, about the intoxicating allure of power and its inevitable corruption, about the fragility of loyalty in the face of greed, and about the tragic destiny that awaits those who build their kingdoms on a foundation of fear and blood. Their story is a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting back the consequences of our collective failures. And as long as those underlying conditions of inequality and corruption persist, the phantom of the Magliana will remain, not as an active threat, but as a silent warning, a ghost from a recent, violent past, whispering that it could all happen again. And so, we have journeyed together from the dusty, forgotten periphery of 1970s Magliana to the pinnacle of criminal power, and down through the bloody civil war, and the patient, relentless work of justice that ultimately returned these phantoms to the shadows from whence they came. The saga of the Banda della Magliana is now complete, a closed chapter in the history of Rome. Yet its echoes will reverberate for as long as the city stands. It is a story that needed to be told, not to celebrate the criminals, but to understand the intricate and terrifying mechanics of power, to honor the victims, and to pay tribute to those who fought against the darkness. We have navigated the complex web of their alliances, from the street corners of their own neighborhood to the secret lodges of propaganda do, and the hallowed halls of the Vatican, witnessing how crime, when it reaches a certain scale, ceases to be a mere violation of the law and becomes a dark art of governance, a sinister parallel to the legitimate state. We have seen how the pursuit of absolute power, devoid of any moral compass, inevitably leads to absolute self-destruction, a lesson written in the blood of its own founders. The rise and fall of the Banda della Magliana serves as an eternal testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of terror, demonstrated by the magistrates, the police, and the citizens who refused to be permanently broken. It is a stark reminder that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that the fight for justice is a continuous one, requiring courage from each new generation. As this story concludes, we must carry forward the lessons it has imparted. We must remember that the most dangerous phantoms are not those that haunt ancient ruins, but those that are born from modern failures, from social neglect, political corruption, and economic injustice. The Banda is gone, but the conditions that created it can re-emerge anywhere, in any society that becomes complacent. Let this narrative be a beacon of awareness, a call to always question, to always demand accountability from our institutions, and to never romanticize the brutal reality of organized crime. The echoes have faded, the phantoms have departed, but the memory remains, not as a monument to infamy, but as a shield for the future. Thank you for listening. If you found this journey into the heart of one of history's most compelling criminal sagas enlightening, if you believe in the power of understanding our past to protect our future, then I urge you to like, subscribe, and share this channel. Your engagement helps us continue our mission to bring you the most thorough and accurate narratives, to uncover the truth hidden in the shadows, and to ensure that the correct information reaches you, the audience. This is our call to action. Join us in this pursuit of knowledge. Until our next exploration into the untold stories of our world, this is your narrator, signing off. Remember the story of the phantoms of Rome, and remember that the greatest stories are often the true ones.